The smell of stale coffee and forgotten cigarette smoke clung to the air in the cold case unit, a perpetual fog that seemed to seep into Detective Alex Rourke's skin. Rourke was a man built for shadows and quiet dread, his face etched with the exhaustion of seeing too much human darkness. He wasn't exactly assigned to the old, Unit 7, files, he was exiled. A minor insubordination, a major clash with the chief, now he was babysitting decades of unsolved nightmares. His current project, a case labeled The Nightmare Alphabet, was a binder thicker than his forearm, brittle with age and sealed with a final, chilling note from the original investigator: some shadows are best left undisturbed. This is not a man, but a pattern. The case centered around 4 seemingly unrelated disappearances that had occurred over a 6-month period in 1988, all within the city's notorious, forgotten district, known locally as the Saints Graveyard, a stretch of abandoned factories and decaying tenements. Victim A, Alan Ace Crawford, a small-time drug dealer, vanished from his apartment complex parking lot. Victim B, Beatrice Bex Holloway, a high school dropout and aspiring artist, vanished from a bus stop. Victim C, Carl Cap Peterson, a night shift janitor, vanished from his workplace, the old city library. Victim D, Dora D. Sanchez, a homeless woman, vanished from a sheltered alleyway. The original investigation stalled, concluding no link beyond the location. No bodies, no ransom, just 4 names and a chilling gap in the city's history. Rourke felt the familiar, dull ache of bureaucratic failure until he noticed something missed by everyone. The evidence logs contained an entry for a 5th piece of evidence found 3 years later, in 1991, during a demolition of the old city library. Evidence file 1991-005-U7, 1X microcassette tape, found sealed within the cornerstone of the city library's main reading desk. Note attached: listen to A, B, C, D, E is waiting. The tape, inexplicably, had never been processed. It was labeled simply, the chorus. Rourke's pulse quickened, cutting through the lethargy. He found the evidence locker receipt, signed by a retired evidence tech named Hollis. Hollis was still alive, living out in the suburbs. He drove out immediately, the binder riding shotgun. When he found Hollis, the old man was frail, living in a house meticulously clean but smelling faintly of mothballs and fear. Rourke presented the tape's file number. Hollis went pale. The chorus: they told me to forget that. Told me it was a kid's prank. Static. Did you listen to it? Rourke pressed. Hollis slowly nodded, his eyes wide and fixed on a spot behind Rourke's shoulder. Once. It wasn't static. It was screaming. But not from pain. It was screaming about something. And there was a rhythm, a voice underneath, whispering a poem. The poem. I can't remember the words, only the cadence. Like a heartbeat, but wrong. Hollis leaned in, his voice a terrified rasp. Rourke, the voices on that tape. They weren't actors. They were A, B, C, and D. And they were still live when that was recorded. The detective drove back to the precinct, the microcassette now secure in his inner jacket pocket, the fear Hollis had exuded now his own personal chill. He checked the evidence database again. The tape was still logged as static/unprocessed. Someone had actively buried this. Back in the cold case unit, Rourke retrieved an ancient tape player. The metallic click as the cassette locked into place sounded deafening in the quiet room. He pressed play.at first. There was only the low hiss of the tape. Then, a low, rhythmic thumping, the heartbeat Hollis mentioned. And then, the voices. They weren't screaming in agony. They were chanting, a dissonant, frantic whisper. The eye is shut, the name is called, the needle drops, the wall is tall. A, B, C, D. E is the key. The voice of a man, clear and calm, finally cut through the chant, speaking directly into the recorder. It sounded like a confident announcer, introducing a show. Good evening, St. Jude's. This is your host. You've been asking about the missing children of the alphabet. You've been searching for the pattern in the dark. Detective Rourke, I've left you a gift. Not a clue, but an invitation. I'm ready for the next round. The next letter. And the next body. Come find the rest of the chorus. I'll be waiting at the place where the graveyard meets the light. The tape clicked off. The chilling silence of the cold case unit crashed back and Rourke didn't need to look at a map. He knew the intersection. The Saints' graveyard, the abandoned district, bordered the decommissioned St. Jude's lighthouse overlooking the bay. He stood up, grabbing his service weapon and his car keys. The Phantom dossier was no longer a cold case. It was a live broadcast. And the killer was calling him by name. Detective Alex Rourke felt the damp, salt-laden wind hit him as he parked his unmarked Crown Vic near the crumbling foundation of St. Jude's lighthouse. It was 2 in the morning, and the crescent moon offered little help, swallowed by the perpetual cloud cover rolling in from the bay. The structure was an imposing, conical monolith of gray stone, decommissioned in the late 1990s and left to rot, a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the sky. The gate was rusted open, groaning a welcome. Rourke shone his heavy-duty flashlight ahead, the beam cutting through the dense coastal fog. The air here was heavy with the smell of brine, decaying seaweed, and something else, something metallic, like old blood and ozone. The killer had named him. That was the central terror. Not a random psychopath, but one who was watching him, actively setting the stage for a private audience. The ground floor entrance to the lighthouse was boarded up with plywood, but a section had been neatly pried open. Not forced, but carefully opened, as if by someone with a key and plenty of time. Rourke drew his weapon, the cold steel a reassuring weight. He slipped inside. The interior was a circular echo chamber. The air was colder here, stagnant. Dust motes danced in the lone cone of his flashlight beam. The main winding staircase, wrought iron and spiraling endlessly upward, stood before him, its steps slick with condensation. He started the climb. Every footfall on the iron grating clanged with unnerving resonance, amplifying the silence. Halfway up, he stopped. He noticed a detail the police sketch artists had missed on the original 1988 reports. The walls weren't just stone. They were lined with small, square ceramic tiles, a dizzying, repetitive mosaic. As Rourke ascended, the air grew noticeably warmer. He reached the final landing, the keeper's level, where the massive Fresnel lens once rotated. The lens was gone, leaving a gaping hole covered by a heavy mesh screen, exposing the brutal wind and the dizzying drop. On the floor, exactly in the center of the room, was the gift the voice on the tape promised. It was a meticulous arrangement, almost an art installation, a perfectly clean, white porcelain doll, sitting upright. Beside the doll, a small, worn leather-bound diary, surrounding both. A perfect circle drawn on the dusty floor with what looked like dried powder, sulfur, or perhaps pulverized chalk. Rourke didn't touch the circle. He used a pen to flip open the diary. The handwriting inside was elegant, looping, and feminine. He recognized the name scrawled on the first page, Beatrice Holloway, victim B. He skimmed the last entry, dated 2 days before her disappearance. I feel like I'm being watched. Not by a person, but by the air itself. Like the city knows my secrets. The man with the soft voice keeps showing up. He asked me if I ever felt like screaming, not to stop pain, but to wake the world up. He gave me a small, beautiful gift. Said it was the key to seeing the pattern. Rourke flipped back to the previous pages. No mention of the man, no descriptions, just typical teenage angst, until the final week. He noticed the small, beautiful gift now. It was the porcelain doll. He shone his light on it. It wasn't just a doll, it was the mechanism of a ventriloquist's dummy, its mouth carved with a perpetual, manic grin. Then Rourke saw the final, chilling touch. Scrawled in black marker across the lighthouse window, facing the dark city, were 2 giant letters, stark against the condensation. E and F. E is the key, the tape said. Now, F was next. As Rourke reached for his radio, a sudden, piercing noise erupted. It wasn't the wind. It was a mechanical, grinding sound, the sound of an ancient mechanism coming back to life. He looked up at the ceiling where the main light assembly had been. The empty mesh-covered hole began to glow. A single, enormous halogen lamp, hidden until now, ignited with a blinding flash, sweeping its powerful beam across the Saints' graveyard, illuminating the decaying streets below. But the light wasn't white. It was a deep, sickly red. As the red light swept over the room, the walls of the lighthouse changed. The square ceramic tiles that lined the interior suddenly appeared wet, reflecting the red light with a horrifying sheen. Rourke's blood ran cold as he realized what he was looking at. The walls weren't tiled. They were covered in thousands of small, square, meticulously mounted photographic negatives. And the sickly red light was turning them into instantaneous, ghostly slides. Every square image flashed a brief, terrifying glimpse of the 4 missing victims, Alan, Beatrice, Carl, and Dora, captured in their final moments, bound, terrified, but still alive, all looking directly into the camera, all standing against the same dimly lit, tiled background. And then, one image stabilized, held perfectly in the center of the beam, a 5th victim. A woman, sobbing, her face obscured by shadows, but her hand held up. On her palm, scrawled in black ink, was the letter E. The red beam locked onto the image for 3 agonizing seconds, bathing the room in the terror of the moment. Then, with a final, massive electrical crack, the bulb exploded, plunging the top of the lighthouse into suffocating darkness and leaving the terrible image burned onto Rourke's retina. He finally reached his radio, his hand shaking, and whispered his findings into the receiver. The lighthouse was not just a symbol, it was the killer's darkroom. The voice on the tape had said, "I'll be waiting at the place where the graveyard meets the light." Rourke realized the chilling truth: the killer wasn't waiting for him here. The killer had just left, having finished his work. The next letter was F. And the killer had just illuminated the entire hunting ground. Detective Rourke worked the next 12 hours straight, fueled by cold coffee and the adrenaline spike of the red light explosion. He'd cordoned off the lighthouse and brought the recovered items, Beatrice's diary and the unsettling ventriloquist doll, back to the precinct. Forensics was baffled. The tiles on the lighthouse wall were indeed photographic negatives, all developed but unprocessed, mounted with surgical precision using a fast-setting resin. They represented thousands of still frames, likely from a surveillance system, documenting the 4 victims' last known movements. The sheer scale of the operation suggested months of preparation and a staggering, methodical insanity. The doll was worse. It was custom-made, its joints lubricated with a synthetic oil, its wood grain sanded smooth. Lab analysis found trace amounts of skin cells and hair strands from all 4 missing victims, A, B, C, D, embedded deep within the mechanism of the doll's mouth and throat. The doll wasn't merely a message, it was a disturbing container, a physical echo of the victim's final moments. "He's collecting more than just memories, Rourke," commented Dr. Lena Morales, the forensic pathologist, her voice hushed. "He's integrating them. He put their DNA into the object that produces a voice." Rourke kept thinking about the chilling voice on the tape, the host, and the victim's desperate chanting. The screaming not from pain, but about something. He revisited the original investigator's note: "This is not a man, but a pattern." The alphabet, Rourke muttered to himself, pacing the evidence room. A, B, C, D, E was the 5th victim, the one whose face was dark, whose hand had the letter. Now F. He pulled up the city directory, filtering for businesses or locations beginning with F, in the Saints Graveyard District. Faraday's Funerary Services, abandoned; the 5th Street Fabricator, demolished; Fortuna Arcade, closed 1995, none of them felt right. The killer was too theatrical, too precise to use a simple location marker. The letters had to relate to the victims themselves. He's building a chorus. Rourke suddenly realized. Ventriloquism. A chorus requires voices. But what about the one who speaks? The host. He focused on the final moments of victim E from the red-lit flash, a woman, her hand up, marked with E. It wasn't a warning, it was a clue written on her body. Rourke tracked down the retired evidence tech, Hollis, again, this time dragging him to a secluded precinct interview room. The rhythm, Hollis. Tell me about the rhythm in the screaming. Hollis fidgeted, sweat beading on his forehead. It was like a stutter. A pause. 4 short beats, then a long one. Always. Rourke grabbed a pen and paper. A, short, B, short, C, short, D, short, E, long. The pattern is 5, Rourke stated, his eyes blazing. 4 people vanished quietly in '88, but the 5th one, E, was the recording, the key. E is the first piece of the puzzle, the one he used to communicate. He used the fifth act to call attention to the first four. Just then, his partner, Detective Mia Chen, rushed in. "We've got a live one, Rourke. Looks like F just got claimed." A frantic call had come in from the security guard at the long-abandoned Fortuna arcade. A young woman, a graduate student named Francesca "Fran" Davies, who was studying urban decay, was reported missing. Her tripod and camera were found smashed on the sticky, neon-lit floor of the arcade. Rourke raced to the Fortuna arcade, a mausoleum of forgotten leisure. The arcade was a labyrinth of shadows and broken glass, smelling faintly of stale popcorn and ozone. In the center of the main floor, under the flickering remnants of a Pac-Man sign, Rourke found the killer's newest offering. It wasn't a body. It was a macabre sculpture. The killer had taken hundreds of old arcade tokens, brass, shiny, and worthless, and melted them down, pouring the molten metal into a custom mold. The result was a chillingly accurate anatomical model of the human larynx and vocal cords, affixed to the base of the brass throat, with a small, silver pin, was a note written on a card from the city library: "You found the key, E, detective. But you didn't look close enough at the pattern. A, B, C, D. 4 puppets. E is the throat. F is the first sound of the new chorus. I don't take bodies, detective. I take their capacity for voice. She is silenced. Find the sound." Rourke realized his mistake. Francesca Davies, F, was not the target. Her voice was. The killer was performing an elaborate, psychological vivisection on the city's identity, removing its means of communication piece by piece. He looked down at the tokens making up the brass throat. They were from the Fortuna arcade. F. The real victim was still out there, silent, and the killer was now ahead of him, already planning G. But Rourke had one new, terrifying piece of data: the killer needed the victim's capacity for voice. He radioed Chen: "Forget missing persons. Start running every police report from '88 to now involving laryngectomies, vocal cord damage, or documented mutism in the Saints graveyard area. We're looking for someone who was already silenced. Someone who could be an easy F to disappear." The game wasn't about the alphabet of the missing. It was about the anatomy of terror. Rourke's command to check old reports on vocal injuries in the Saints graveyard district was a fishing expedition, but it hit the jackpot. Detective Chen, working the dusty archives, found a 1996 medical file flagged by the city, a compensation claim for an industrial accident at the Garrett Gauge and Gear Factory. The victim was George Finton, a foreman. Finton had been involved in an explosion that cost him his left hand, and, more significantly, damaged his vocal cords so severely that he was rendered permanently aphonic, unable to speak above a raspy whisper. The file noted Finton had become a recluse, living off a small pension in a forgotten tenement adjacent to the abandoned factory. George Finton. The letter F was satisfied, but Finton's name didn't begin with F. This killer was playing a deeper game, twisting the rules. F for Finton's factory, or F for the sound he could no longer make. It's about the function of the letter, not the name, Rourke theorized, driving toward the Garrett Gauge factory. A, B, C, D were the original, loud voices. E was the throat, the chorus. F is the silenced voice. The Garrett Gauge factory was a massive, skeletal building of steel and grime, an architectural corpse. Finton's tenement was connected to the back wall by a narrow, unpaved alleyway. Rourke and Chen moved tactically, flashlights sweeping the alley. They found the back door of the tenement ajar. The apartment was small, meticulously organized, and empty. A dusty, old-fashioned workbench sat in the center of the living room, covered in tools, screwdrivers, fine wires, and, disturbingly, several partially disassembled laryngoscopes. On the wall above the bench, Rourke saw it, a diagram, drawn in charcoal, of the human ear, the cochlea, the auditory nerve, and the labyrinth. Beside it, the killer's latest message, scrawled in red paint: "G is the receiver, he was planning G here," Chen whispered, her hand hovering near her sidearm. But what did he want with Finton? Rourke noticed a trail of fine, gray dust leading from the workbench toward a boarded-up door at the back of the tenement, a door that connected directly to the factory floor. They kicked the door open and stepped into the factory's main assembly floor. The cavernous space was completely dark, save for the weak, intermittent ambient light filtering through high, grime-caked windows. It smelled of motor oil and decay. Rourke shone his light forward. The killer hadn't taken Finton. He had used the factory as a stage for his final act with F. George Finton was present. He was suspended 20 feet above the floor, hanging from a massive overhead chain hoist used for lifting heavy machinery. He was still alive, bound tightly, his eyes wide and panicked. Looking down at them, his mouth was gagged with heavy industrial tape. The killer had ensured Finton's voice, already stolen by the accident, could not even attempt a sound. Rourke immediately hit his radio. "We have a live victim, George Finton, at Garrett Gauge. Requesting SWAT and ESU for high-angle rescue, now." As Rourke scanned the area for the killer, the low, mechanical thrum of the factory's old power generator roared to life in the basement. The sudden noise was followed by an immediate, terrifying reaction from Finton. Hanging high above, the gagged man began to convulse violently, his body thrashing. Rourke looked up, tracking Finton's terrified gaze. Above Finton, suspended from the same hoist, was a heavy, rusty metal press, the kind used to stamp sheet metal, balanced precariously. And attached to the chain of the press was a crude, homemade trigger mechanism connected to the factory's main power line. The press was designed to drop upon a power surge. The generator starting up had just initiated the lethal sequence. A booming, amplified voice echoed through the vast, empty factory. It was the host from the tape, chillingly clear, broadcast over the factory's ancient, neglected intercom system. A, B, C, D. 4 voices I heard. E, the throat I kept. F, the sound I eliminate. You are the audience, Detective Rourke. A tragedy demands sound. The moment the surge hits the peak, Mr. Finton will be silently crushed. A perfect elimination. You have less than 60 seconds before the capacitor overloads. You can't reach him in time. You can't cut the power from here. But you have one choice to save the silence. Look to the gear. Rourke's light snapped to the giant, 10-foot diameter main gear assembly sitting ominously on the floor near the hoist's base. It was the main drive gear for the whole floor. The gear was partially covered by a thick, heavy steel plate, bolted down. And on that plate was a small, blinking digital timer, counting down from 0:45. The only way to stop the power surge and the press from dropping was to physically interrupt the mechanism. The timer was counting down to the surge, not the drop. The bolts. Chin yelled, pointing to the 4 massive bolts securing the plate. We need to unbolt that plate and cut the power line underneath. But Rourke saw the second part of the threat. The host had left one final, horrifying gift on the gear assembly, a disassembled gun. Not a complete weapon, but a collection of parts, barrel, slide, magazine, and a single, shining brass casing. The killer was forcing a choice: save the silent, or collect the clue. If they wasted time analyzing the G clue, Finton would die. If they focused only on Finton, they would lose the key to the next victim. Rourke handed Chin the bolt wrench. Start on the plate, fast. I'm going for the gear. He focused his flashlight on the disassembled gun. The brass casing was engraved. He recognized the pattern instantly. It wasn't just a letter. It was a cipher. The next move was dependent on this immediate, paralyzing decision. The timer on the gear assembly flashed 0:18. Rourke, I need help on this last bolt. Chin shouted, straining against the rusted metal. Rourke made a lightning decision. Saving George Finton was paramount, but losing the G clue would guarantee the next murder. The killer had engineered a moment of paralyzing choice. Keep going, Mia. I'll get this. Rourke yelled, knowing he had to secure the casing while Chin worked the bolts. He snatched the single brass casing from the assembled gun parts. It wasn't engraved with a simple G. It was etched with 3 perfect, tiny symbols: sad face GH, a simple directional arrow. G leads to H. The G was the transition phase. The killer was moving from the anatomy of voice to the grammar of the pattern. Rourke tucked the casing into his pocket just as the timer hit 0:05. "I'm clear," Chen screamed. She ripped the steel plate off the gear assembly, revealing a nest of thick electrical wiring beneath. The booming voice of the host returned, more excited now. "Tink. Tock. Boom." Chen plunged the wrench into the exposed wires, searching blindly for the main line. A massive shower of sparks erupted, blinding white, followed by a violent thwack as the wrench shorted the circuit. The factory generator immediately sputtered and died. The mechanical thrum ceased. Up above, the press, having completed its lethal cycle, dropped a mere foot before the power cut. It hung still, inches above George Finton's struggling, bound body. Silence. Heavy, absolute silence, broken only by Finton's muffled sobs of relief. Rourke slumped against a rusted support column, heart hammering. They had won this round, but only barely. Rescue teams arrived 5 minutes later, rappelling down to secure Finton. Rourke used the window of confusion to secure the rest of the clue, the charcoal diagram of the ear and the remaining gun parts. Back at the precinct, Rourke stared at the brass casing. George Finton was F. Rourke summarized to Chen. The silenced voice. The factory was the G setting, the gauge and gear. G is about hearing. The diagram on the wall was an ear. He took the voice, now he's targeting the sound. Chen pulled up the database for the Saints Graveyard District. If the pattern is structural, H has to be a place. Hospital. Housing. Harbor. Rourke looked at the evidence, the anatomical focus, the theatrical stage setting, the calculated use of names and functions. Think of the host, Rourke said. He speaks like a producer, an architect. A, B, C, D were loud. E was the throat. F was the silence. G was the hearing. H must be the home or the habitat. Where people are most vulnerable, most themselves. He zeroed in on the abandoned housing projects near the riverfront. One complex stood out, the Helix Apartments. A massive, decaying structure known for its spiraling internal staircases, a perfect anatomical parallel to the cochlea, the spiral part of the ear. They had a place. Now they needed a victim. Rourke went back to the original nightmare alphabet file. He focused on a single name from the list of witnesses who were uncooperative in 1988, Helen Vance. A teenage runaway at the time, she was living rough in the Saints' graveyard and was the only person who reported seeing victim B, Beatrice Holloway, get into a strange, windowless van. Vance vanished from police records shortly after the initial interview. Helen Vance, Rourke said, pointing at the old photo. Helly. H. She saw the crime, she knows the van. She's the next intended audience member. The killer is clearing the witnesses. They drove to the Helix Apartments, a hulking monument to urban failure. Rourke knew time was short, the host was moving faster now. They found Helen Vance's apartment, a squat occupied by dozens of other forgotten souls. The room was empty, her few belongings scattered. But on the cracked plaster wall, the killer had left his newest diagram, drawn this time in fresh, wet blood, a perfect diagram of the labyrinth, the system of semicircular canals in the inner ear responsible for balance and orientation, and below it, written in the same blood, the host is here. The chorus is assembled. The labyrinth leads to the listener. H is off balance. Follow the spiral, detective. But beware the sound that guides the lost. A faint sound drifted down the twisting, dark stairwell, a sound that shouldn't exist in a desolate, power-cut building. It was music. Not loud, but perfectly distinct, an old, carnival-style organ grinder, playing a slow, looping, terribly cheerful melody. The kind of music that accompanies a puppet show. Rourke and Chen exchanged a look of cold dread. The killer wasn't targeting the eyes or the throat this time. He was targeting the victim's sense of direction and mind. The hunt for H had begun in a dizzying, spiraling labyrinth of terror. The cheerful, out-of-place melody of the organ grinder echoed through the central stairwell of the Helix Apartments, twisting the oppressive silence into something manic and wrong. Detective Rourke and Chen moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping the landings, their beams swallowed by the immense structural decay. The killer was deliberately using sound to disorient them. The Helix apartments, true to their name, were designed around a relentless, spiral staircase, creating a dizzying, internal vortex. The labyrinth diagram, Rourke whispered to Chen, pointing to the winding, rusted railing. It's not just a message, it's a map. The killer is disorienting Helen Vance, playing on the inner ear, the balance. The music seemed to emanate from the floor below them, yet the acoustics of the spiral structure made it impossible to pinpoint the exact location. Rourke pressed his back against the cold, damp wall. He wants us to follow the sound, Rourke muttered. Which means the victim is away from the sound. Rourke remembered the ventriloquist theme. The killer was the host, the victims were the chorus. A puppet show required an audience and a stage. Look for the light, Mia, Rourke instructed. Not a flashlight. A stage light. They ignored the descending melody and started climbing, moving up the spiral. They passed floor after abandoned floor. The air grew colder, and the carnival music faded, replaced by the relentless, mocking drip-drip-drip of water. On the highest floor, the former rooftop access, exposed to the howling wind, they found the setting. Helen Vance, H, was there. She was alive, huddled behind a stack of cinder blocks, rocking herself, her eyes wide with terror, staring at something Rourke couldn't yet see. She was too traumatized to speak, even if she had wanted to. The organ grinder music, muffled and distant, now drifted up from the very bottom of the stairwell, 8 stories below. In the center of the concrete rooftop landing, the killer had built his newest stage. It was a perfectly constructed miniature set, a small, wooden replica of the St. Jude's lighthouse from Part 2. The replica was about 3 feet tall, incredibly detailed, and its tiny beacon was rotating, casting a weak, mesmerizing red light. And next to the replica, seated in a tiny, custom-made chair, was the final, terrifying piece of the puzzle, a small, exquisitely crafted wooden doll. The doll's face was carved with fine features, and its clothing was made from scraps of fabric identifiable as belonging to Helen Vance's missing gear. It was a perfect, miniature effigy of H. Attached to the doll's miniature throat was a microcassette recorder, the same model that recorded the chorus. The tape was playing a single, looped sound, a high-pitched, piercing scream, Helen Vance's scream, recorded perhaps moments before they arrived, now looping endlessly inside the wooden doll's body. The killer was stealing the recording of the voice, turning the victim into a permanent sonic artifact. As Rourke took a step toward the traumatized woman, a chilling sound erupted from the tiny lighthouse replica. Not the music, but the distinct, calm, amplified voice of the host, piped through a tiny speaker hidden within the beacon. Welcome back to the show, Detective Rourke. H is now a permanent addition to the chorus. She is not lost. She is found. I told you the labyrinth leads to the listener. Helen Vance heard things she shouldn't have. Now she is balanced forever. Look at your new clue, Detective. The host always leaves a preview. The small, rotating red beacon of the miniature lighthouse focused its light onto a single element of the scene, the wooden doll's hand, engraved deeply into the doll's tiny palm. Rourke saw 2 distinct letters, intricately carved, I and J. The killer wasn't working sequentially anymore. He was working in pairs. The transition G had led to H, and now H was pointing to the next sequence, I and J. Rourke signaled Chen to secure Helen Vance and then approach the doll. He needed the clue, but he knew touching the scene was exactly what the host wanted. As he reached for the doll, he saw the final, psychological horror. The doll's tiny feet were attached to a thin, nearly invisible wire, which snaked down the spiral stairwell, all the way to the bottom. The music they had followed was not a distraction. The organ grinder was a lure, and the killer was at the base of the spiral. Watching, Rourke snatched the doll and the recorder. He looked down the endless, dark spiral of the Helix apartments. The cheerful organ music stopped abruptly. A calm voice, amplified by the building's massive geometry, floated up from the darkness of the ground floor. Thank you for attending, Detective. You have the I and the J. I is for the witness. J is for the judge. It's time for a public hearing. Check the docket for tomorrow's headline. The silence that followed was broken by the distant, accelerating sound of a car engine peeling away. The host was gone. Rourke and Chen had saved Helen Vance's life, but the killer had stolen her mental balance and left behind a recording of her terror, a chilling new addition to the Phantom dossier's chorus. The alphabet of terror was now a new phase: justice and judgment. The killer was escalating, moving the game from abandoned sites to the heart of the city's authority. The immediate aftermath of the Helix incident was chaos. Helen Vance, traumatized and unable to speak, was taken into protective custody. Rourke delivered the evidence, the miniature lighthouse, the wooden doll with the embedded scream, and the new I&J clue, to the forensics lab. The chilling message: I is for the witness. J is for the judge. Check the docket for tomorrow's headline, was a direct threat to the legal system. Rourke knew the killer was aiming for a public, symbolic act. He contacted Captain Hayes, his longtime rival, who was now forced to listen. Captain, the killer, the host, is moving into the legal sphere. He's targeting someone connected to the original 1988 case, or perhaps someone who judged his earlier work. Rourke ran a search on all individuals involved in the 1988 Nightmare Alphabet case who held legal or judicial authority and whose names began with I or J. He found one immediate hit: Judge Jeremiah J. Irons, the presiding judge in the preliminary inquiry of the 1988 disappearances. Irons had swiftly dismissed the case due to lack of tangible evidence, publicly stating that the police were chasing urban legends. His first initial was J, and his last name started with I. The pairing was too perfect. Rourke's blood ran cold. The killer was going after the men who had formally silenced the investigation. Judge Irons is J, Rourke stated to Chen. The judge. The killer is going to stage a trial. But who is I? The witness. The most infamous I in the city was the Insomniac, a shadowy figure known for leaving rambling, paranoid manifestos on obscure public forums. The Insomniac claimed to have been an eyewitness to many of the city's worst crimes, including the 1988 disappearances, but was always dismissed as delusional. Rourke found a recent post by the Insomniac that confirmed his current location: an old, decommissioned courthouse archive building, the Index Hall of Records. The host was setting the stage for a forced confrontation between the men who silenced the case, J, and the men who was silenced by it, I. Rourke drove straight to Judge Irons's well-guarded suburban home, while Chen took a squad car to the Index Hall. Judge Irons was initially dismissive. Irons, you're the target, Rourke snapped, showing him that J is for judge. Note: the killer is calling you out for dismissing the 1988 case. Irons' face finally paled. The case, the pattern. He shook his head. I didn't dismiss it because of evidence, Rourke. I dismissed it because the original lead investigator, Detective Kellogg, begged me to. Said it was bigger than the law. That it was infectious. A new letter. K. Suddenly, Irons' security alarm shrieked. A frantic voice came over the internal speaker. Sir, there's a package at the front door. It's ticking. Rourke drew Irons out of the house, pulling him toward the backyard. Rourke's heart pounded not with fear of an explosion, but with recognition of the killer's flair for the theatrical. The host would never use a simple bomb. Rourke cautiously approached the front door. The package was a vintage wooden briefcase, and the ticking was the rhythmic, relentless tick-tick-tick of an old metronome. Glued to the top, attached to the briefcase, was a note addressed to Rourke. The verdict is in, Detective. Judge Irons has been a terrible custodian of the silence. But I do not kill the judges, I simply remove their authority. Now, go to the witness. The trial is waiting. Rourke opened the briefcase. It wasn't a bomb. It was a meticulously disassembled wooden gavel, its pieces laid out like surgical tools. Next to it was an official-looking court document, a fake summons for Judge Irons to appear at the Index Hall of Records, stating he was now compelled to serve as a witness in the trial of the Phantom dossier. As Rourke was processing the non-lethal threat, Chen's frantic voice burst over the radio. Rourke. I'm at the Index Hall. I is gone, but the killer left his mark. It's horrific. I need forensics here immediately. Rourke sped to the Index Hall, a cavernous, dust-choked building filled with miles of steel shelving. Chen met him at the main lobby, her face white. The insomniac, Chen said, pointing to the center of the lobby. The host hadn't killed the men, but he had removed his capacity to be a credible witness. His mind. On a large, antique table lay the insomniac's belongings, his ragged clothes, his paranoid notebooks, his spectacles. And lying perfectly centered on the table, still steaming slightly, was a meticulously prepared human brain, removed with surgical precision. A note was pinned to the exposed cortex with a long, silver dissecting needle. I is for the intellect. The witness cannot speak without the mind. The judge cannot judge without the witness. The host is now the new authority. His verdict, guilty of inaction. The next lesson is on the law. Look for the next victim at the place of the K and the L. The host was no longer interested in the physical anatomy of voice, but the jurisprudence of silence. He had stripped the witness of his intellect and the judge of his authority, leaving both alive but crippled. Rourke looked down at the preserved brain, the pinnacle of the human intellect, sitting exposed on the cold metal. The killer was proclaiming himself the final arbiter of justice. K and L, Rourke whispered, feeling the weight of the new letters. We have to find Detective Kellogg, the original lead. And L must be the physical location of the law. The surgical removal of the insomniac's brain, a crime against the mind itself, sent shockwaves through the city's underbelly, but the official report was buried under a veil of public safety. Rourke was now chasing two intersecting threats, the retired Detective Kellogg and the location, L, the site of the host's next lesson. Kellogg is the key, Rourke told Chen, studying the old case files. He told Judge Irons the case was infectious. He was the one who logged the cassette tape and then retired immediately after. Rourke and Chen finally tracked down Detective Ronald Kellogg, living in a subsidized retirement community miles outside the city limits. Kellogg was a ghost of his former self, jumpy, paranoid, and clearly medicated. Rourke sat opposite him, showing him the chilling note from the lighthouse. Some shadows are best left undisturbed. This is not a man, but a pattern. Kellogg stared at the note, his hand trembling. I wrote that. I knew he was still out there. The alphabet killer. He's not a killer, Rourke. He's a curator. He doesn't take lives, he curates silence. Why did you bury the tape, Kellogg? Rourke pressed. The chorus. Kellogg whispered, tears welling in his eyes. Because of the bodies. The 4 from 88. They weren't just missing. Their bodies were found, a year later. Unidentifiable, dissolved, in 4 separate chemical vats in the Saints' graveyard. The city hushed it up to prevent mass hysteria. But the medical examiner found something the public never knew. What? Rourke demanded. The bones. Their skeletons had been meticulously carved. Etched with tiny, geometric symbols. The ME called it post-mortem scrimshaw. It wasn't random. It was a language. The killer wasn't just silencing them, he was writing on them. Rourke felt a new wave of nausea. The killer's pattern was deeper than anyone imagined. The tape was found sealed in 91, Rourke said. If the bodies were found in 89, why did you bury the tape in the cornerstone? Because the tape was the translation, Kellogg choked out. The host sent it to me directly in a box with a note that read, listen to the screams, and you will learn the grammar of grief. I was afraid, Rourke. I was afraid to learn his language. So I entombed it. Kellogg then revealed the location of the next target, L. Before I left, I remember the killer's first manifesto, a rambling letter. He called his work the Lexicon of Loss. He said the only true library in the city was the one that housed the law. The location was the Lexington City Law Library, a massive, neo-Gothic building located centrally, miles away from the decrepit Saints' graveyard, a bold move into the public domain. Rourke raced back to the city, his mind reeling from the revelation of the carved skeletons. The killer was not just a stage producer, he was a scribe of death. He met Chen outside the Lexington Law Library. It was late, but the library was still open to students. The security guard was oblivious. They found the killer set up on the 4th floor, in the restricted rare text section. The room was empty of people, but but filled with the overpowering scent of formaldehyde and old paper. In the center of a long, polished reading table lay the law library's original 1888 charter, a massive, leather-bound volume. The host had staged his scene on the charter itself. He had taken the insomniac's preserved brain, the stolen intellect from Part 7, and sliced it into thin, precise cross-sections. These brain slices were then meticulously placed, one by one, into the empty, rectangular spaces cut out of the charter's aged paper, replacing the original legal text. The human brain, the witness's intellect, was now physically integrated into the city's law. A small sign, professionally printed, stood beside the charter, Exhibit L, the lexicon of loss. Attached to the brain was the newest clue, written on a bookmark made of smooth, pale bone. The silent have the language. The judges have the lexicon. But the city has no memory. The host will teach them all. Your next step, detective, is finding the memory. M and N await you. M is for the map. N is for the name. As Rourke was photographing the macabre exhibit, the building's massive, ornate iron gate slammed shut at the far end of the room with a sickening clang. The intercom system crackled, and the calm, confident voice of the host filled the library, amplified by the high ceilings. A, B, C, D, they are written. E, F, G, H, they are observed. I and J, they are judged. Now K has been activated. Detective Kellogg, my first audience, told you the truth. And now, my final gift for the night, a lesson in your native tongue. A loud, piercing alarm began to sound, a high-frequency tone that made Rourke's teeth ache and his equilibrium sway, a direct, sonic assault on the inner ear, a callback to the labyrinth from Part 6. Then, from the air vents, a fine, gray powder began to drift down, coating the rare books and the floor. It was a chemical irritant, designed to induce panic and disorientation. The host was locking them in to face the chemical and sonic assault, ensuring their departure was difficult, chaotic, and publicly notable. Rourke grabbed Chen. Out. Now. M and N, Mia. We're looking for the city's memory. They burst through a side fire door, leaving the law library and the horrifying lexicon of loss behind. The alphabet of terror was moving from the abstract to the tangible, focusing now on the city's history and its victims' names. Rourke and Chen escaped the Lexington Law Library as chemically induced public panic locked down the downtown core. Sirens wailed in every direction. At headquarters, Rourke stood before a crowded evidence board, trying to thread together the pattern. A, B, C, D, the 4 original victims. E, the throat, the audio tape. F, the silence, George Finton, stripped of his voice. G, the listening, the gauge and gear factory, the ear. H, disorientation, Helen Vance, the witness robbed of balance. I, the mind, the brain of the insomniac, robbed of thought. J, judgment, Judge Irons, robbed of power. K, activation, Detective Kellogg, triggered to speak the truth. Now came M and N. M is the map. N is the name. A city without memory, Rourke repeated host's message. Host is talking about the 4 forgotten victims from '88. He tapped the board. The map. What holds the memory of deaths the city tried to bury? It has to be where they found the carved bones. He dug into Kellogg's old files and found the 1989 anatomical report on the 4 bodies recovered from the chemical vat. The locations, 4 empty lots scattered around the Saints Graveyard district, each within 2 blocks of the lighthouse. The map isn't a street atlas, Chen said. It's something tied to burial. To memorial. Rourke remembered a detail from his talk with Judge Irons, Irons' middle name, Jeremiah. Mia, Rourke said, the realization snapping into place. All the victims had plain, forgettable names, Beatrice, David, Evelyn. Except one, Nigel Northbrook, who ran the now-defunct funeral service nearby, the one that processed the 88 bodies. Nigel Northbrook. N, the name scrubbed from the public reports to sever any link to those deaths. Rourke pulled Northbrook's address. He lived in a townhouse near the old chapel, facing a small park built over one of the bulldozed lots where the bodies were found. The park's name, Marion Park. M is Marion Park, Rourke said. The memory map is right on top of the burial ground. Host is forcing Nigel Northbrook, N, to remember and point the way. They drove to Marion Park, a sad little square of green behind a rusted iron fence. The place seemed uneventful, except for the broken stone fountain at its center, dry and stained. But on the paving stones around the fountain, the killer had left their latest work. The entire park had been transformed into a single giant map. Using red reflective paint, the killer had drawn meticulous lines and symbols across the flagstones, depicting the streets, alleys, and key locations of the Saints' Graveyard district. At the center of the greater map, atop the dry fountain, sat a small box, like a reliquary. Nigel Northbrook was the more horrifying sight. He lay face down across the map, bound and unconscious. The killer had positioned him precisely on the spot corresponding to the old chapel. The worst part was Host's method. Host hadn't mutilated his body. Instead, they had used surgical adhesive to glue Northbrook's forehead to the stone, forcing him to cling to the memory map. A small slip of paper rested in his bound hand. N is for name. Northbrook remembers what should not be remembered. He buried, but Host recorded. The foundation of silence is strength. Detective Rourke, look at the map. You have found M and N. You know K. Now Host will introduce O. O is the organ of speech. P is power. As soon as Rourke touched the reliquary on the fountain, a hidden speaker beneath the stone crackled to life. A new voice played, not Host, but Nigel Northbrook's own voice, low and shaking, narrating. He described in detail the secret burial of the carved skeletons, the questions he'd asked, the answers Kellogg had given him about the art carved into the bone. Host had recorded Northbrook's confession, forcing him to become the public organ of speech, O, for his own guilt, using the map, M, and the name, N, as the stage. Then the confession cut out. Host's voice took over. O is the organ of speech, detective. And Northbrook's organ will appear on every front page in the morning, forcing the city to remember. But to complete it, we need power. P is power. The power of the press. I will find it at the oldest newspaper office in this city. But Rourke, I still need one last piece to finish the map. I will find old Peter Quartz. Q, the men who drew those maps. The audio died. Rourke had Northbrook, a living victim turned into a public confession. But Host was already moving toward the final targets, old Peter Quartz, retired city cartographer, and the next stage. The old newspaper office. The killer was building a media storm, using their victims as chess pieces to drag the city's cover-up into the light. The revelation that the alphabet victim skeletons were carved with a secret language, a lexicon of loss, sent a cold spike of dread through Rourke. The killer was more than a theatrical psychopath. He was a dark historian, documenting the city's failures on human bone. Rourke and Chen secured Nigel Northbrook, whose forced confession, O, the organ, the public voice of the scandal, was already circulating among reporters. The Host had achieved his goal, forcing the forgotten names back into the public memory. The next targets P, the power, and Q. P is the power of the media, the press, Rourke deduced. The old printing house. And Q is the final name. The only remaining, operational, historical printing house in the Saints' Graveyard was the Quill and Press Building, the former home of the city's first newspaper. This was the location of P. The victim, Q, was named by the Host, old Peter Quartz, the former city cartographer who had drawn the official maps that omitted the original chemical vat sites, the very map, M, the Host forced Northbrook to lie on. Quartz is the last witness to the cover-up, Rourke realized. He falsified the official memory. The Host is forcing him to redraw history. They rush to the Quill and Press Building, a massive, block-long structure of industrial brick and tall, narrow windows. The place was deserted, smelling of ink, oil, and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. The main press floor was cavernous. In the center stood the massive, silent machinery of the old printing press, cast iron, rusted, and imposing, a symbol of communications power. Old Peter Quartz, a frail, elderly man, was tied to the main roller mechanism of the printing press. He was conscious, terrified, and staring up at Rourke with panicked, pleading eyes. The host was not present, but his voice boomed through hidden speakers, echoing the vast, empty space. Welcome to the final edition, Detective Rourke. P is the power. The power to print the truth, or the lie. Mr. Quartz drew the false maps that silenced A, B, C, and D. Now, he will be printed into the lexicon himself. On the enormous paper spool next to Quartz, the killer had loaded a massive roll of newsprint. Already, the first few feet had been printed, unfurling onto the floor, leading toward the far wall. The text being printed was not traditional language. It was a flawless, enormous reproduction of the geometric symbols carved into the original victim's skeletons, the lexicon of loss. The killer was printing his language of silence for the city to read. Attached to the power switch of the printing press was the final, terrifying trap, a simple, glass jar filled with a corrosive acid, balanced on a spring-loaded tray. The moment the power switch was flicked on to save Quartz, the jar would tip, spilling the acid onto the printing rollers and the paper, destroying the lexicon and potentially harming Quartz. A note was tacked onto the side of the printing press with a long, sharp quill pen. The truth cannot be destroyed, detective. It can only be published. You can save Q, the cartographer, but you will destroy the only copy of the lexicon. Your final choice, the life, or the language. You choose the next letter, R or S. As Rourke hesitated, his eyes darting between the acid jar and the power switch, Chen pointed to the far wall. The killer had constructed his final exhibit there, using the unfurled, printed lexicon as a backdrop. On a large wooden easel, centered beneath the printed symbols, was a complex, hand-drawn map. It was a new, meticulously detailed map of the Saints' graveyard, showing all the key locations, the lighthouse, the arcade, the factory, the Helix apartments, and the 4 original burial sites. The entire map was an anatomical diagram of the alphabet sequence, and in the center of the map, centered on the old, decommissioned city library, victim C's last known location, the killer had drawn a large, bold letter R dot below the letter R. A single, final phrase was written, R is for the repository. Rourke looked at the printed symbols on the floor, the chilling language of the dead, knowing that if he lost the lexicon, the city would never understand the full depth of the cover-up, and the killer's work would remain untranslated. Mia, Rourke ordered, his voice grim. Call ESU. Tell them we have a hostage tied to a massive, unstable press. Tell them not to touch the power switch. I'm going for the lexicon. He couldn't sacrifice the proof of the killer's full insanity. He moved cautiously toward the unfurling paper, his eyes fixed on the printing roller where Quartz was bound. He reached the paper and carefully began tearing it away from the roller, securing the printed lexicon. As he did, a small, black radio receiver, hidden on the floor, crackled to life. It wasn't the host's voice, but a sharp, high-pitched screech, the sound of feedback. The sound was immediately followed by a loud, rhythmic metallic clank. 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 The printing press, despite the power being off, began to move. Slowly, inexorably, the massive roller began to turn. The killer had rigged a counterweight system, a massive, hidden lever connected to the roller's safety brake, triggered by the release of the lexicon paper. Old Peter Quartz screamed, muffled by the binding, as the roller began to slowly pull his torso into the main mechanism. Rourke scrambled, ignoring the printed lexicon, reaching for the only thing that could stop the immediate mechanical crush, the emergency brake, located on the far side of the machine, near the acid jar. Rourke lunged across the floor, the metallic clanking of the printing press mechanism accelerating. Old Peter Quartz was sliding inexorably toward the main roller, his muffled screams choked by the binding. The massive iron machine was a death trap powered by a clever counterweight, activated the moment Rourke began tearing away the printed lexicon. Ignoring the spilled ink and the precious paper, Rourke reached the emergency brake, located right next to the acid jar. He slammed his palm against the rusted red lever with a grinding shriek. The roller stopped, inches from Quartz's head. The spring-loaded tray, jarred by the sudden halt, finally gave way. The acid jar tipped, but instead of spilling onto the roller, it splashed harmlessly onto the heavy cast iron floor beside the machine. Rourke quickly cut Quartz free with his utility knife. The old cartographer was weeping, unable to speak, but alive. Chen, who had been securing the printed lexicon of loss, the language of the carved bones, looked at Rourke, breathless. He chose the machine over the acid. He wanted us to believe we had to choose between the life and the language. He had a backup plan for the life. This whole sequence was about the R. Rourke grabbed the map the killer had left on the easel, the final anatomical diagram of the saint's graveyard, with the central letter R over the old city library. R is the repository, Rourke said, his voice flat with grim realization. The place where the missing pieces are stored. The library. Where victim C vanished, where the original tape, E, was sealed in the cornerstone. The library is the host's memory bank. The host's final note had promised a choice, R or S. Rourke knew the host hadn't intended for the press sequence to be lethal, it was designed to force them toward the next step. The old city library is being renovated into the new special sections archive, Chin supplied, looking at the city planning reports on her phone. The storage. S is for storage. He's there, Rourke confirmed. The host is performing the last rite at his repository, archiving his work before vanishing. And he's waiting for us. They raced to the old city library. It was under heavy construction, completely dark, surrounded by scaffolding and chain-link fences. Rourke and Chin cut through the perimeter. Inside, the library was a chaotic maze of plastic sheeting, stacked drywall, and concrete dust. The familiar smell of dust and decay mingled with something else, the sterile, acrid smell of formalin. They followed the scent to the former rare book section, the room where victim C, the janitor, vanished in 1988. The room had been gutted, stripped down to its support beams. In the center, under a lone, harsh bare bulb hanging from the ceiling, stood the host. He was a man in his late 50s, impeccably dressed in dark, surgical scrubs, his face calm, almost serene. He was not a brute, he was academic, precise. He stood over a makeshift altar, a metal workbench covered in tools and equipment. Beside him, two objects lay on the bench, the original, full-sized Fresnel lens from St. Jude's Lighthouse, Part 2, now stripped bare and polished to a blinding sheen. A meticulously organized binder, thicker than Rourke's own dossier, labeled, The Completed Chorus. The host looked up, smiling faintly. Detective Rourke. You finally learned the language. You arrived at the storage. I've been waiting for my final audience member. Rourke drew his weapon. It ends here. Turn around. Endings are messy, detective, the host said, his voice the same calm, resonant one from the tapes. Patterns are clean. I didn't kill A, B, C, and D for violence. I killed them to give them a voice, a language carved into their very existence. The city forgot them. I made them the first words of the lexicon. He picked up a small, custom-made device from the table, a sound amplifier connected to a headset. My name is Simon Scott. I was the chief acoustician who designed the sound systems for this very building in 1988. I heard the screams of the missing janitor, Carl Peterson, victim C, trapped in the ventilation system. I heard them all, Rourke. They called to me to be their voice. I am not a killer. I am a curator of silence. Simon Scott pointed to the massive Fresnel lens. The lens is the final artifact. It takes light and focuses it into a single, blinding beacon. Just as I took the city's scattered silence and focused it into the phantom dossier. He then picked up a final object, a small, smooth, polished stone, carved with a single letter. T. The game is over, detective. But the pattern continues. T is the tune. I have archived my work. Now, it's time for the final performance. Scott did not try to run. Instead, he raised his voice and began to speak, not to Rourke, but to the empty, echoing building. My chorus. My lexicon. I leave you with the full, complete truth of the city's silence. The language of the dead is now printed. The work is done. Farewell. He placed the sound amplifier device over his head, put his fingers into his own mouth, and pulled. Scott didn't scream, but a high-pitched, inhuman sound, amplified and warped by the device, pierced the air, a sound that was pure, focused feedback and static. He was replicating the terrifying sound of the original tape. The sound was so focused, so high, that Rourke and Chin instinctively clapped their hands over their ears, their equilibrium shattering. The host wasn't committing suicide, he was launching a final, sonic attack designed to disorient and collapse the building's temporary support structure. With a tremendous, sickening creak, a major support beam above Scott's head snapped. Rourke tackled Chin out of the way as the beam crashed down, destroying the workbench and the Fresnel lens, burying the host in a cloud of dust and debris. Rourke staggered up, the sonic reverberation still ringing in his ears. He was alive. Simon Scott was silenced forever, crushed beneath his own final stage. Rourke looked at the wreckage. All that remained intact was the large binder, the completed chorus. The tomb had claimed its last resident. Detective Alex Rourke stood in the ruins of the city library archives, the dust settling on the fallen beam and the body of Simon Scott, the self-proclaimed curator of silence. The ringing in Rourke's ears was slowly fading, replaced by the profound silence of a closed case and an open, festering wound in the city's history. Forensics swarmed the site, recovering Scott's body and, crucially, the large, intact binder, the completed chorus. Hours later, Rourke sat alone in the cold case unit, the phantom dossier binder finally closed. He placed the host's final binder on his desk and slowly opened the cover. It wasn't a confession, nor was it a diary of murders. It was a terrifyingly meticulous academic record, a thesis of terror. The binder contained 26 sections, one for every letter of the alphabet. Each section was dedicated not to a victim, but to a concept of silence or communication that Scott had physically enacted. A, B, C, D, the forgotten words. Original victims. E, the vocal mechanism. The cassette tape. F, the loss of sound. George Finton. G, the receptor. The ear diagram. H, the loss of balance. Helen Vance. I, the loss of intellect. The insomniac's brain. J, the loss of authority. Judge Irons' gavel. K, the trigger. Detective Kellogg. L, the lexicon. The law library. M, the mapping. Marion Park. N, the narrator. Nigel Northbrook's confession. O, the organ. The public voice. P, the press. The printing house. Question, the cartographer. Peter Quartz. R, the repository. The library. S, the scribe/silence. Simon Scott himself. The remaining 10 sections, T through Z, were blank, save for titles written in Scott's elegant hand. T, the tomb.U, the unsaid.V, the verdict.W, the witness, true.X, the x-axis, hidden dimension.Y, the yield.Z, the zenith. Scott had completed his alphabet of terror up to his own demise, leaving the rest as a theoretical challenge. But the most critical part of the binder was the last section, containing the original, printed-out lexicon of loss, the sheet of symbols Rourke had risked his life to save from the printing press. Rourke sent the lexicon to the city's top linguists and cryptographers. They returned a week later, pale and exhausted, confirming Kellogg's terrifying suspicion: the carvings were indeed a language. "It's not a cipher, detective," the lead linguist explained. "It's an archaic form of Sumerian cuneiform, adapted to a modern geometric script. A language of pure geometry and measurement." Scott was communicating with the bones, not about them. The translation of the symbols on the skeletons was slow, painful, and deeply disturbing. It wasn't a message, it was a complex mathematical formula, correlating the victim's time of death, age, and location to specific astronomical coordinates, a dark map of the cosmos. The final printed text of the lexicon was Scott's terrifying thesis statement, translated from the geometrical script: "The city is a lie built on forgotten geometry. The screams of the lost are the only honest sounds in the universe. I have restored their voices by giving them the only language the cosmos understands: measurement and silence. The city now has the full alphabet of its guilt." Rourke looked at the evidence board. They had solved the disappearances of 1988, found the bodies, and exposed a massive cover-up fueled by fear and negligence. Scott had forced the city to face its own forgotten darkness. The host was dead. The case was closed, but as Rourke packed up his own belongings, ready to leave the cold case unit for good, he picked up the host's final, carved stone, He looked at the alphabet on the board, the chain of terror complete, A to S. Rourke flipped the stone over. Engraved on the back of the small, smooth stone, in the host's perfect script, was one final letter, written in red ink, U. T is the tomb, detective. But U is the unsaid. The silence you created by